Welcome back. My name is Parsa. I'm a medical student with nearly a decade of experience investing in stocks and real estate. And today I want to bring your attention towards TransMedics, a medical technologies company which essentially provides the logistics and devices for organ transplant centers. And this company's had an absolute tear over the past few years. They're up about 114% in the past year. Year to date, they're up 12% already. And the main thing this company provides is a device that essentially keeps organs beating and blood flowing to these organs after they've been recovered from a donor, most often deceased. Now, we'll go into a little bit more detail about the competitors and what the actual landscape looks like for transplant centers, but I want to show you a video of what this actually looks like, because this is quite insane to see that we're capable of doing this, and the outcomes are quite magnificent, and we'll get into that a little bit more in detail later. But another thing they provide is that logistics. So they provide end-to-end support, helping centers across the country and across the world get organs transported to them, and a main thing that they provide is an increase in the availability of organs. So they increase the volume that a given center can do. They are quite costly compared to some of the competitors. The main competitors are the traditional approach of what you might have seen in movies, which is essentially just a cooler with ice that holds the organs in transportation. Now, it's not great. It's the current standard. I think the current estimates are around 30% of transplants in the United States still use this type of transportation. Now, the biggest player in the space by volume actually isn't TransMedics. It's a company called Paragonix. And these guys have been recently acquired. I'll go into a little bit more depth about them later on. But they are essentially an evolution on that ice storage method. It essentially provides a actively managed cold storage, and it has quite improved outcomes compared to traditional ice. These guys have a large percentage of the market. They're also still able to provide that long distance availability of organs, which you can see that a lot of centers are even using transportation for over 3,000 miles with these systems. And we can also see that about half of the brain death donor hearts were transported via this Paragonix cold storage. Now, there's a lot of different ways that these organs can be recovered for transplantation. Some of them come from live donors, often loved ones, but most of them come from deceased donors. Now, there's different definitions of death, and there's different means of recovering these organs from these individuals accordingly. Brain death is the most typical one. It's the most straightforward. There is something called circulatory death, which in the context of this conversation is only important because there's a very narrow window within which one can recover organs from these individuals. And about 30 to 40% of cases where we could have organs recovered from these individuals, it is discarded because it's not within that very tight window. Now, if it's too soon after declaring circulatory death, there's some ethical issues. If it's too late, there is enough damage to these organs where you don't actually have something that you can transplant. Now, one of the main things that differentiates TransMedics from Paragonix is the fact that it can expand the available population of organs for transplantation, and therefore increasing the volume of organ transplants that can be done. Now, there's multiple ways it does this, one of which depends on that circulatory death, that narrow window, because of the fact that it can keep the organs essentially at a near alive state, keeping them beating, keeping blood flow, and actively monitoring them. It has a much easier time recovering organs from these patients. Another thing that helps differentiate Paragonix versus something like TransMedics is the fact that we can expand the available donor base because of that ability to keep the organs essentially beating and alive for longer. We can see that they've done some studies looking into recovering organs from donors who had risk factors that typically make them ineligible for being a donor. And we can see that they can still have a success rate for transplants that's pretty similar to what it typically is with brain death patients on ice. Now, that's really promising. And when we look at the total number of organ transplants done in the United States annually, there were around 48,000 organ transplants done in 2024, and that's thought to grow to around 50,000 in 2026. The overall market's not growing that fast, and there's other data that backs that up, but this is not due to a lack of demand. There's almost 109,000 people currently waiting for an organ transplant in the United States. This is purely the availability of donors, the availability of organs. That's the main rate limiting factor. And again, when 30 to 40% of these potential donors are being lost for circulatory death because of that narrow window, the ability to expand the availability of those organs and the ability to get organs from patients who are not the ideal candidate, and also considering that developed nations have aging populations that also have a lot of cardiovascular diseases that are growing, this helps make sure that we're a bit more future proof in terms of eligible donors for transplants, especially with the need for transplants growing as these comorbidities grow. Now, coming back to it, the growth rate for the overall number of transplants is around 3-ish%, and it has been around that mark for a couple years now. But a large percentage of this growth is coming through lung transplants and liver transplants. Now, that's important when we look at the finances for TransMedics, because the biggest segment for them is the liver transplant segment. The growth rate, again, around 41% year over year, with the overall revenue growth around 32-ish% year over year, even though the overall market size is growing at 3% per year. One thing to keep in mind, they do have that service revenue, but in that competitive analysis comparing Paragonix and TransMedics, it's also worth mentioning that Paragonix was recently acquired in 2024 for a figure that is less than the annual revenue of TransMedics. So even though Paragonix has a massive lead in terms of volume, because of the pricing power that TransMedics has with their warm perfusion, with the ability to keep these organs beating, they're able to charge a much higher price per transplant, and so they're still the larger company. So wrapping up this comparison between Paragonix and TransMedics, Paragonix by volume is the much larger company. They have the biggest share of the American market. They're completing about half of the heart transplant. But the main point is that there is some white space left. There's a lot of centers. I think about 30% of centers still use the traditional ice cooling approach. Paragonix is essentially an evolution on the ice cooling approach and allows for transportation across states. It allows for long distance transportation and some improved results. But TransMedics is not an evolution of cold storage. It is essentially a revolution of it, having a warm perfusion approach, essentially keeping this blood flow supply to the organs. And because of that, there's a lot less damage received and a lot less strain on these organs. So we can see a lot more organs being eligible for transplants that were previously discarded. And so in a space where there's nearly 109,000 people currently waiting for a transplant in the United States alone, this is a massive unmet need. There's a massive market that couldn't be addressed. And when we look at the financials, they're growing at around 30-ish% in a market that's overall growing at a volume of around 3%. So they are taking market share. They are taking a lot of market share from the traditional approach of ice cooling. That's estimated to be around 30-ish% in the United States still, but they're also able to expand internationally. They've recently started a process of going into the European markets. They're partnering with Mercedes-Benz. It's worth mentioning that Paragonix is already in the European space, but I think this could be another area where, again, the market can be growing. Both of these companies can be growing, but with TransMedics charging much more per transplant, having better strategic positioning in the long run, with the fact that they can increase the overall availability of organs, as well as there potentially being less organs that are eligible for transplants under the current definitions, from the fact that we have an aging population, so a lot of the criteria would exclude these older donors. I think TransMedics has a good strategic positioning compared to competitors. Now, the expected growth rate is around 50% annually. A lot of that comes down to both margin expansion as well as continued revenue growth. We can see in the past few years, they've become a lot more profitable, and we've seen margin expansion. That's expected to continue in the future. They're expecting to see continued growth. I think there's enough white space, especially with 30% of the American markets still being the traditional ice cooling approach, as well as adding in the international expansion routes. This could be a pretty good bet. A few more details that are important in this assessment is the valuation. The PE is around a 51 in the trailing 12 months, with the growth rate around high 30s, low 50s. I think that's a pretty fair multiple to give to this company with strong strategic positioning and a track record of growth. There have been some drawbacks in the past. That was primarily from missing earnings expectations. If there's a drawback like that, that would be kind of a steal in this company, I think. But some other points that are important are the fact that we have free cash flows significantly growing. It's finally become positive. And in terms of stock-based compensation, it has been growing. It's going at around 50% CAGR, but at a value of 9 million, it's not really something that I'd be too concerned about. Earnings are expected to continue growing. I think it's a pretty good company. I think it's something that I would be interested in adding into my portfolio in the future. Again, if there's another drawback, I'd love to hop in here. As of right now, I don't really have a cash position that I'd think is worth putting towards this. And I don't have other positions that I'm looking to sell that I want to put in this as well. So it's something that I'm going to definitely put on my radar. I think if some of you viewers are already holding this company, I think it's a good bet in the long term. I'm definitely excited to see how the international expansion goes. There have been some analysts that have provided some caution, saying they want to see how the rollout in the European market goes. I imagine that going pretty well, especially considering that there aren't that many international competitors already there. They have strong positioning overall. I think it's pretty good. Moat's pretty strong on this company, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. If you guys have any feedback, any other companies you want me to take a look at, let me know down below. I have been a bit sick and traveling, so the uploads have been a bit more inconsistent, but I'll get that portfolio overview out soon. If you guys have any companies you think I should drop to get TMDX, I'd be curious to see what you guys think for that too. Thanks again for listening, and have a good day.